The afternoon sun beat down on the dust-covered corral, where a line of ranchers stood still behind the old wooden fence, their broad hats casting shadows over sun-worn faces. No one said a word. Inside the pen, the black bull, towering, furious, legendary, stomped the ground as if daring anyone to try their luck. His name was Midnight, and everyone present had heard the stories. The injuries, the broken gates, the temper that no handler could tame. The auctioneer had gone quiet. No more fast-talking, no more bidding. Just tension. Until the silence was pierced by something no one expected, a soft sound of footsteps, light and uncertain, entering the arena. Heads turned. Eyes widened. A young girl, no more than 9, stepped onto the dirt. Her dress was plain and dusty, her shoes worn. She walked slowly, one hand outstretched, fingers brushing the air as if searching for something unseen. Because she couldn't see. Her name was Clara Mayfield, and she was blind. Shock rippled through the crowd. A murmur of concern, disbelief. "Get her out of there!" someone whispered sharply. But no one moved. Clara continued forward, her small frame completely vulnerable in front of the massive, restless bull. Midnight's nostrils flared. He turned, his heavy hooves crunching the ground. Everyone held their breath. Then, something unimaginable happened. Clara stopped in front of Midnight and reached out. Her tiny hand found his muzzle, and instead of recoiling or charging, the beast stilled. A hush fell over the corral, deeper than before. Her fingers gently traced the outline of his scarred face. Midnight gave a low grunt, not of anger, but of surrender. Clara leaned in closer, rested her head softly against his. No one could believe what they were seeing. Grown men who had ridden wild horses and buried brothers on these lands now stood silent, hearts pounding. Sheriff Walt Briggs, watching from the edge, removed his hat and stared with a mixture of awe and heartbreak. He had known Clara's father, Eli, killed 2 years ago by a bull not unlike this one, right here in this same dirt. Since then, Clara hadn't spoken much. Hadn't come back. Until now. No words were spoken between girl and beast, but something passed between them, something deeper than language. Midnight, the terror of the plains, lowered his head, leaning into Clara's embrace like a child craving warmth. In that moment, time seemed to stop. But just as peace settled into the scene, a loud clang echoed from the gate behind them. The crowd turned. Midnight tensed, and Clara's hand slipped slightly from his face. The sharp clang of the gate sent a jolt through the corral, slicing through the stillness like a blade. Midnight's ears twitched, his massive body recoiling just slightly. The muscle in his shoulder twitched, and a deep rumble grew in his chest. Clara didn't flinch at first. She stood completely still, her head still near his, one hand lightly resting against his cheek. But even she could feel the shift. The calm she had brought was slipping. Her fingers trembled. "Get her out of there now!" a man shouted from behind the fence. A few cowboys moved toward the gate, but Sheriff Briggs raised a hand to stop them. "Don't," he said firmly. "Not yet." His voice was low but carried weight. He had seen enough in his lifetime to know when something beyond logic was happening. His gut told him this moment needed stillness, not panic. But even he knew it was hanging by a thread. Clara turned her head slightly, listening. She could tell something had changed. Her lips parted as if she might speak, but no sound came. She hadn't spoken much since her father's death. Grief had stolen her voice the same way it had taken her light. But now, with the bull's breath warming her hands, her voice felt closer than it had in years. Midnight snorted again, uneasy. He shifted his front hoof, and the dust around them stirred violently. She took a slow step back, her hand still on Midnight's face. "It's okay," she whispered finally, barely audible, her voice dry from disuse. It was the first word many of those men had ever heard from her. And to everyone's astonishment, the bull calmed. His breathing slowed. His head lowered again. Whatever wall had been breaking between them was not yet lost. But Clara could feel something else, something deep in Midnight's body that spoke of more than fear. It was pain. She moved her hand lower, down his neck, over a patch of matted fur. Her fingers felt a raised, fresh wound, deep and recent. A branding scar, not yet healed. A wave of sorrow washed over her. They had hurt him. Badly. And he wasn't just angry. He was scared. Clara took a deep breath. Somewhere behind her, she heard a man cry. Not loud, but enough. Even the toughest hearts knew they were witnessing something raw, something true. And just as the tension began to ease again, a voice broke through the crowd, gravelly, bitter. "That bull ain't safe. I say we put him down before someone else ends up like her daddy." The words hit Clara like a slap. She froze. Midnight stirred again. Sheriff Briggs turned slowly toward the voice, but it was too late. Midnight raised his head high. His body tightened. And Clara didn't move. The corral fell into a dangerous silence. Midnight's muscles were pulled tight as rope. His hooves shuffled in the dirt, shoulders twitching like he was ready to explode. The voice that had pierced the calm came from a man named Roy Tillman, one of the oldest ranchers in the county. His voice was known, hard, sharp, unapologetic. He stepped forward, arms crossed. "That animal's got a kill in his blood," he spat. "We've seen this before." Clara stood still, her small hand resting just above Midnight's jaw. The bull hadn't moved, yet, but his breathing had changed. It was faster now, erratic. The trust they'd built was fragile, hanging by a single thread. And that thread had just been yanked. Clara didn't know who the voice belonged to, but the words had cut deep. She felt a strange heat rise in her chest. Not fear, something else. Something stronger. Something she hadn't felt in a long time. Sheriff Briggs narrowed his eyes. "Roy," he said slowly, "this ain't your call." But Roy was already shaking his head. "It wasn't my call when Eli died, either. We all remember what happened that day. That bull charged, and no one could stop it. I say we learn from it this time." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Old memories hung heavy in the air, memories of Clara's father lying broken in this very pen. A death none of them forgot. A death some, including Roy, believed could have been prevented. Clara knelt slowly in front of Midnight, ignoring the murmurs behind her. Her fingers traced the ridge of his scar again. "You're not like the others," she whispered. "You're not a monster." She wasn't speaking just to him now. She was speaking to herself, to her memories, to the story everyone had told her since her father's death, that bulls were dangerous, that this place had taken something from her she could never get back. But something inside her knew that wasn't the whole truth. Midnight's breathing slowed slightly. The tension in his front legs softened. And Clara, still blind, still small, leaned in once more and rested her hand over his heart. She felt it beating, strong but steady. He wasn't lashing out. He was waiting, listening, trusting her. But the others couldn't see what she saw. Roy was already moving toward the gate, shouting something about tranquilizers and rifles. And in that moment, Clara stood up and turned her face toward the men. Her voice came out clear, soft, but firm. "If you hurt him," she said, "you'll lose more than just a bull." The crowd went silent again. Even Roy stopped. And just then, Midnight took a step forward, toward the fence, toward the men. The dust rose beneath him, and all hearts held still. Midnight's hooves sank into the dirt as he stepped forward, the dust curling around his legs like smoke. He wasn't charging. He wasn't even tense. But the sheer size of him, each slow, deliberate step, was enough to make even seasoned cowboys grip the fence tighter. A few stepped back, eyes flicking toward Roy, who still held the tranquilizer rod like it was the only thing keeping order. But no one moved, because all eyes were now on Clara. She stood near the center of the pen, her face tilted toward the sound of the bull's breathing. Clara raised her hand slowly, not to touch, but to signal, to remind Midnight she was still there. Her voice, soft but unwavering, broke the thick silence. "He's not dangerous," she said. "He's just been hurt too many times." The way she said it didn't sound like a guess. It sounded like a truth only she could understand. Roy scoffed from the sidelines. "We've all been hurt, girl. But we don't go tearing through fences and trampling people." His words landed heavy, and a few men nodded. But Sheriff Briggs didn't. He was watching Clara more closely now. Watching the way Midnight responded to her, the way his movements slowed whenever she spoke. There was a rhythm between them, an unspoken current no one else could seem to touch. Clara lowered her hand and stepped toward Midnight again. "He remembers," she whispered. "He remembers what they did to him, what they made him become." She paused, her chest rising slowly with each breath. "Just like I remember what I lost here." She reached out and touched Midnight's scar once more. It was swollen and raw, a mark left by cruelty, not nature. The bull stood still beneath her hand, his eyes softening, his breathing even. Not angry, not wild, just tired. The crowd remained frozen, caught between fear and awe. Sheriff Briggs felt a pit forming in his stomach. He had kept quiet for years, letting people believe Eli's death was just a tragic accident. But it hadn't been. Orders had been rushed. Safety checks skipped. And Eli had paid the price. Looking at Clara now, Briggs saw not just a child, but a mirror of guilt, staring back without knowing it. Then came the sound. A loud clack of iron against wood. The side gate was opening again, but this time with purpose. Clara turned her head quickly, sensing the shift. Midnight lifted his head. The dust stirred around them once more. From the shadows near the gate, Boots stepped into the light. Someone had returned, someone the town never expected to see again. The boots were old, scuffed, and caked in dust, the kind worn by men who had spent their lives working the land and hiding from the past. As the figure stepped fully into view, the crowd stiffened. A few gasped quietly. Sheriff Briggs's eyes narrowed, and Roy Tillman muttered something under his breath. Clara turned her face toward the movement, her expression confused but calm. She couldn't see the man, but everyone else could. Colton Mayfield had returned. Colton was Eli's younger brother, gone from the county for nearly 3 years. He had vanished shortly after Eli's death, leaving behind a swirl of rumors and unfinished business. Some said he ran because of guilt. Others believed he'd gotten into trouble far from home. But there he stood now, taller, older, leaner, and with a look on his face that didn't match the quiet rage still hanging in the air. His eyes went straight to Clara, then to Midnight. "Didn't expect to see you back here," Briggs said, voice low and tense. "This ain't your land any more." Colton nodded once, never taking his eyes off the bull. "I didn't come for land," he replied. "I came for her." His voice cracked just slightly at the edges. "And for him." He nodded toward Midnight. The crowd murmured again. Even Roy looked uncertain now. "You always had a way with bulls," someone whispered from behind the fence. Clara tilted her head. "Colton?" she asked, recognizing the voice she hadn't heard since the funeral. He stepped closer to her, stopping just outside the pen. "It's me, sweetheart." Midnight shifted, snorting softly as if sensing something in Colton's presence. Clara turned toward the bull again. "He's calm," she said. "He knows you." And he did. Colton had worked with Midnight when the bull was just a calf. Before the beatings. Before the aggression. Before Eli's death. Colton looked at Briggs, then at the fence of men, many of whom had stood there the day Eli died. You all want to put him down. But none of you saw what I saw. He didn't kill my brother. He was scared. Cornered. Eli tried to stop the others, tried to stop the beating. His voice caught. They didn't listen. For the first time in years, the truth was laid bare. Not an accident. Not a random act of violence. A tragedy created by cruelty. Midnight let out a low, rumbling breath and took another step forward. Clara stayed beside him, steady and calm. Colton climbed the fence slowly and stepped into the pen. No one stopped him. The bull looked up. 3 hearts, broken in different ways, now stood together. And in the silence that followed, something between them began to heal. Colton moved slowly across the corral, each step deliberate, cautious. Midnight watched him without aggression, his eyes following every motion. The bull's body remained still, but his ears twitched as Colton approached. Clara didn't move. She stood at Midnight's side, one hand gently resting near his shoulder. "He remembers you," she said softly, almost as if reassuring both the bull and the man. Colton nodded, his voice low. "I remember him too, before everything went wrong." Sheriff Briggs leaned against the fence, arms crossed tightly. Guilt gnawed at his gut. He'd buried the truth for years, let the town believe Eli's death had been a freak accident. But now, with Colton back and Clara standing beside the bull like some kind of quiet prophet, the lie was cracking open. He looked over at Roy, who was clearly unsettled, his jaw clenched, fingers tightening around the rail. The old rancher hadn't expected to face the ghosts of that day, especially not like this. Colton stopped a few feet from Midnight. The bull gave a low snort but didn't back away. Slowly, Colton reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small, an old piece of rope, frayed and stained. "This was Eli's," he said, holding it in his palm. "He used it when training calves, and Midnight used to follow it like a dog. You remember this, don't you, boy?" His voice cracked again. Midnight took a step closer, head lowered, eyes locked on the rope. The crowd watched in stunned silence. Clara felt something shift, something deep and old, like grief letting go. She turned her face toward her uncle. "Why did you leave?" she asked. Her voice wasn't angry, just sad, just tired. Colton's eyes closed for a moment. "Because I couldn't stand the sound of everyone lying about how it happened," he said. "And I couldn't stand looking at you, knowing I didn't stop it." He took a breath. "I should have spoken. I should have fought harder. But I was a coward." Clara reached out her hand toward him. "Then speak now," she said. "Because he's still paying for it." She gently touched Midnight again, her fingers brushing his scar. The bull stood between them, calm now, breathing slow and heavy. Colton nodded. "Then let the town hear it straight. Eli died trying to protect this animal, and we all turned our backs on both of them." The words fell like stones, heavy and final. At the fence, Briggs finally took off his badge and held it in his hands, staring at it. Maybe justice had come too late. But maybe it had come just in time. Midnight exhaled deeply, almost like relief. And the sun, sinking behind the hills, cast a golden light across the corral, just as Clara whispered, "He's not the only one who needs saving." As the last light of day faded into dusk, a heavy stillness fell over the auction yard. What had started as just another afternoon of bidding and bravado had turned into something none of them could have predicted. Clara stood beside Midnight, her small frame silhouetted against the fading sun, while Colton stood just feet away, dust clinging to his boots like regret. The bull, once seen as a monster, now stood calm, silent testimony to everything this town had tried to bury. Roy Tillman broke the silence with a voice that cracked under its own weight. "So what now?" he asked bitterly. "We let the bull walk free? pretend none of this ever happened." His words cut through the quiet, but lacked the confidence they once carried. He looked around, searching for agreement, but the faces he turned to had changed. What had unfolded in front of them had shaken something loose. Fear had been replaced by doubt. Doubt by conscience. Sheriff Briggs stepped forward slowly, his eyes never leaving Roy. "No one's pretending anything," he said. "We've all got blood on our hands, some more than others. You want to talk about consequences? Then let's start with truth." He turned to the gathered crowd. "Eli Mayfield didn't die because of midnight. He died trying to stop us from making him what he became. That's on us. All of us." His voice didn't waver. Not this time. Clara listened quietly, her fingers still resting on Midnight's side. She could feel the bull's heartbeat, slow and steady. The fear was gone now. Not just from him, but from her too. For so long, she'd blamed this place for everything she'd lost. But now she saw it clearly. Her father hadn't been taken by a wild animal. He'd been taken by men too proud to admit they were wrong. And by silence. Colton turned to the sheriff. "What happens next?" he asked. It wasn't just a question about the bull. It was about everything. About justice. About memory. About whether this town would keep hiding behind old lies, or finally step into the truth. Briggs looked at him, then at Clara, then back at the crowd. "We don't put Midnight down," he said. "We take responsibility. We rebuild. And we start by telling this story right." A murmur of agreement moved through the people. It wasn't loud, but it was enough. Midnight stood quietly between Clara and Colton, the dust around his hooves finally settled. For the first time in years, the past wasn't something to fear, it was something to face. And just as the stars began to appear in the wide Texas sky, Clara whispered, "He's not the only one who deserves a second chance." The next morning came quietly. No announcement, no horns, no dust clouds rising from cattle being herded. Just the sound of wind moving through the old oak trees and the occasional creak of weathered wood from the auction yard fences. For the first time in years, there was no tension in the air. The pen where Midnight had once raged now sat empty. He had been moved, not to slaughter, but to Colton's ranch, just past the ridge. And no one protested. Clara stood at the edge of the fence, her cane tapping softly against the ground. She couldn't see the corral, but she knew every sound it made. Every echo, every silence. Sheriff Briggs approached from behind, walking slowly, as if unsure how to face her. "Town's been quiet since yesterday," he said gently. Clara didn't turn. "It's always quiet after people tell the truth. There's nothing left to yell about." Her voice was calm. Stronger now. Grown. Briggs removed his hat, running a hand through his graying hair. "Your daddy, he was a better man than most of us. He saw what was happening and tried to stop it. I should have backed him up." Clara finally turned to face him. "But you didn't." Her words weren't angry, they were just facts. Honest. And somehow that stung worse than blame. Briggs nodded slowly, his eyes damp. "I didn't. And I've carried that every day since." At Colton's ranch, Midnight stood beneath the shade of a low-hanging tree. His body still bore the marks of the life he'd endured, but his eyes were no longer wild. Clara reached out, her hand brushing gently along his side. "You're safe now," she whispered. Colton stood nearby, a shovel in his hand. He had cleared a space next to an old wooden cross in the field, the place where Eli had been buried. "Figured he'd like to be able to see the bull again," Colton said with a faint smile. The town, too, was starting to shift. The auction yard announced a temporary closure. For repairs, the sign read, but everyone knew it meant more than boards and nails. Roy hadn't returned since that day. Some said he left town. Others said he stayed home, unwilling to face what he saw in Clara's quiet defiance. Either way, the voices that once dominated the corral had gone silent, and that silence held meaning. As Clara stood in the pasture beside Midnight and her uncle, she felt something she hadn't in years: peace. Not because things were perfect, but because the worst part of the story had finally been spoken aloud. The lies had been buried, but the love her father had left behind, that remained. And when Midnight nudged her gently with his nose, she smiled. Some scars never fade, but healing is still possible. Colton sat on the back porch of the ranch house, the old boards creaking beneath his boots. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, where the sky burned orange and purple in the last stretch of evening light. He hadn't felt this kind of stillness in years. Not since before Eli's death. And not since he'd run from everything: responsibility, grief, truth. But now, for the first time in a long while, he felt rooted. Like maybe, just maybe, he belonged again. Clara came walking up the path from the barn, Cain tapping softly beside her. Her boots were dusty, her dress wrinkled, and a strand of her hair was stuck to her cheek from the breeze, but she looked stronger than ever. Midnight trailed behind her, his steps steady, calm. It had been a week since the day everything changed, and not once had the bull shown signs of aggression. People had started calling him the miracle bull in town, but Clara hated that word. "It wasn't a miracle," she said as she sat beside Colton. "It was a choice." He looked over, raising an eyebrow. "His? Or yours?" She shrugged, smiling faintly. "Both." There was a quiet between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was filled with understanding. Colton had missed so many years of her life, but now he was here, present, and somehow that was enough. He reached into his coat and handed her something, an old photograph of her and Eli, taken the year before he died. Clara traced the image with her fingertips. She couldn't see it, but she remembered the moment. Her father's laugh. The way he'd lifted her into the saddle and said, "There ain't nothing you can't do, baby girl." The memory was warm, but it also hurt. "Do you think he'd be proud?" she asked softly. Colton nodded without hesitation. "He'd be proud that you stood your ground, that you saw something in Midnight no one else did." He paused. "That you didn't turn bitter like the rest of us." At the edge of the field, Midnight lay in the grass, chewing slowly, completely at peace. No fence, no chains, just sky and earth and freedom. Sheriff Briggs had visited earlier that day, bringing papers, official ones, transferring full ownership of the bull to Clara. "Call it restitution," he'd said, eyes heavy with guilt. "It's the least this town owes you." As night fell, Clara leaned her head against Colton's shoulder. "I don't want this to be the end," she whispered. "Then don't let it be," he replied. And as fireflies began to flicker in the tall grass and the world turned quiet again, something unspoken passed between them, an understanding that healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means remembering, with love instead of fear. The morning came soft and golden, a breeze drifting through the tall grass like a whisper from another time. Clara stood in the pasture, barefoot, feeling the earth beneath her toes. It had rained lightly the night before, and the scent of wet soil and new life lingered in the air. Nearby, Midnight grazed quietly, his black coat glistening in the early light. He raised his head as she approached, and she smiled, reaching out her hand without hesitation. A year had passed since that day in the auction yard, the day everything changed. The town changed too. The auction grounds had been rebuilt, but not for selling bulls. Now it held weekend gatherings, small concerts, and community meals. The pen where Midnight once stood in rage had been turned into a flower garden. Some said it was Clara's idea, others credited Colton. The truth was, they'd done it together, both needing to replace pain with something that could grow. Colton had stayed. He rebuilt the old house, fixed the broken fences, and opened the ranch to kids from town. teaching them to care for animals, to respect them, not fear them. Sheriff Briggs had retired, quietly and without ceremony, but not before speaking publicly about the cover-up surrounding Eli's death. It didn't erase the past, but it honored it. And for the first time, Clara felt her father's name spoken without shame, just love. As for Midnight, he became a symbol, not of danger, but of redemption. People came from neighboring counties just to see the bull that had once brought a town to its knees, and helped it rise again. He never returned to the arena. He didn't need to. His story was no longer about anger or fear. It was about what happens when someone dares to see beyond the scars. Clara now kept a journal. Colton wrote for her when she needed, but most days she used a recorder. She told Midnight's story in her own voice, and that story found its way onto radios, into classrooms, and through the hands of people who had forgotten how to believe in change. Her voice, once silenced by grief, now carried across towns, across hearts. And on one quiet morning, as she sat in the field beside the bull who had once mirrored her own pain, Clara whispered a final thought to the wind. You don't have to be perfect to be saved. You just have to be seen. Midnight nudged her gently in return, and together, in the stillness of that sacred land, they simply were.